everyone. This is Mark Movsesian. I'm the co-director of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's, and I'm joined once again by my friend and colleague, Mark DiGirolami, the center's other co-director, for another episode of Legal Spirits, which is our podcast series on issues and cases in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived at Apple iTunes, also on Android, and also on our website, lawandreligionforum.org. Okay, well, today, Mark, we have a guest with us, which is always a lot of fun. And Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our guest and get things started.
Wonderful. Well, so we do, in fact, have a little something different today. We're discussing with Professor Lorenzo Castellani his recent book called The Gear of Power. Professor Castellani is a political scientist at the Libera Università Internazionale degli Studi Sociali Guido Carli, which is known by the acronym LUIS, I think, or Luis Guido Carli, but Professor Castellani can let us know exactly what that's all about. And we're going to be talking about his book called L'ingranaggio del potere, which translates to the gear of power. It discusses a very interesting issue that we have actually thought a lot about here before in connection with our tradition project for a number of years, and that is the issue of technocracy. The book for the moment is only in Italian, so we can't get into too many details. But the first order of business is to welcome Professor Castellani. Welcome, and we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Mark and Mark. Thank you very much for your invitations and congratulations for your podcast.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about the book. I found this book, or you made me. We follow one another on Twitter, and so I was able to locate this book through you, and was able to. It's a wonderful read for those that can read Italian, and unfortunately, it's not in English yet. But I thought, well, because there are some overlapping issues for American law and politics in your work, Lorraine, so that we wanted to kind of bring some of the book's themes and arguments to American audiences.
Right. And so our roadmap for this podcast, which I'm looking forward to very much, is first we'll do an introduction to Professor Castellani's theme, which, as Mark says, is technocracy, and also the new technocratic aristocracy that dominates politics and maybe even law today. Professor Castellani, Lorenzo, I'll call you if it's okay. Lorenzo believes this domination has implications for democratic government. Then after that, we'll discuss how technical expertise, what the 20th century thinker Jacques Ellul famously called technique, hides deep moral disagreements and brands opposing moral visions as unscientific and therefore unworthy of consideration. And then finally, we'll talk about two real-world examples of the phenomenon that Lorenzo discusses, one of them from Europe and one from the US. The European one is the conflict between the EU and European nationalist or populist movements, which is a topic that Lorenzo discusses in his book. And then we'll talk about an American example, the cases involving restrictions on worship during COVID-19 that have come up before the Supreme Court. So I'm looking forward to this. Mark, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure, terrific. So Lorenzo, actually, why don't you just give us and our listeners a kind of a quick summary of the book's claims, and particularly focusing on this issue of technocracy and bureaucracy that you talk about.
Yes, the idea of the book was to describe the problem of our democracy from top and not from below. In the last years, we have a very wide literature on populism and electoral changes. But in my view, there was a part of the transformation of our democracies basically based on bureaucracy, on the development of the judiciary, on the multi level governments that was not really addressed by history and political science. So my idea was to describe how these new hierarchical society, for many aspects, was developing, and the main theme of the book is technocracy. So the power of the people who are in power, they have their own posts for their competence, for their technical skills. And the skills, of course, are recognized by the system of university, of PhD, of master studies, and they set up a new aristocracy that is increasingly influential in our democracy, particularly in Europe with the system of European Union, but as well probably in the United States. So I started from history. This is basically a history of technocracy, but I ended up with some thoughts on politics and what might be the pace of politics into a techno-democratic regime, as I called it. So as an integration between technocracy and democracy.
Wonderful. And so I guess one question for you might be whether you think that this is something, well, it's obviously not unique to our moment now because you discuss it in historical perspective, and I think it's probably fair to say you focus on the last 100 years or so. Is that right? I should also mention that
Yeah,
Lorenzo has a wonderful new book on the civil service in the United States, and that one is in English. So these books sort of go together. So one question for you, Lorenzo, is whether this is a phenomenon of the last 100 years, or whether you think that there's always been a kind of
um,
tension between democratic equality and expertise or knowledge and excellence and so on.
well, I started from the mid 18th century, but probably the real transformation, the big leap was in the mid of 19th century, because in this century, the century of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, of course, there was an increasing role of the state and of the bureaucracy into the society, but the bureaucracy were basically institutionalized in the mid 19th century, and they were developing along with the Industrial Revolution. So we might say that the bureaucrats and the managers were growing together, and they were becoming increasingly influential in the system of organized capitalism. And as well, of course, along these two processes there was the democratic development, before in the US and then in Europe. So our society in the last century was a concentration of these three aspects: organized capitalism, bureaucracies, and democracy. And so was my starting point, looking with a perspective of nearly 2 centuries for analyzing this phenomenon.
You know, Lorenzo, it's really interesting when I think about your work. You talk about this new aristocracy, and you say that we don't appreciate how much we have an aristocracy in the West today. And it made me think a lot of the work of writings, recent writings by Rusty Reno at First Things, and also Patrick Deneen, that we have an aristocracy that doesn't recognize itself as an aristocracy. That's part of its power. And you see the paradox, because aristocracies are typically based in birth, and this is an aristocracy that is really based in merit, in passing the right exams and having the right credentials and so on. So, is it really fair to call this an aristocracy? Maybe this is, in fact, just the meritocracy that we're living through.
Well, if we look to the term in ancient Greek, aristoi means simply the best. So it might be related to birth, but even to qualities that are developed during the life of a man. So, from my perspective, we might use aristocracy in the sense that these men who are trained in the universities and they have their technical skills well developed, well, they are part of a system that is enhancing their qualities. And so they are occupying their posts in the society for their technical skills. In this sense, I think they might be considered as an aristocratic movement, an aristocratic group. For sure, we might name them even elites if we want to use a more modern term, referring in particular to Italian thinkers of the 20th century, as Gaetano Mosca or Vilfredo Pareto, who I use very largely in my book. But yes, from my perspective, we have democracy based on demos, and then we have aristocracy based on the aristoi. And the aristoi of today are probably more technocrats or trained people in general, compared to the demos that is made of all of us.
Well, and one interesting issue here, actually, as you talk about your focus being the last 150 years, is of course that that's the period in which democracy really has been has been powerful, right? Has been the powerful movement. So just as I suppose the revolutions of in these various countries happened, overthrowing the previous aristocratic monarchical systems that they had. it was just at that moment that this problem that you identified became more acute, because you still have to have expertise of various kinds. And maybe we could talk a little bit, Lorenzo, about the idea of expertise, because one of the things that you mention in the book is that expertise, at least in this modern context, what it can do is perhaps to hide or bury moral and political disagreement under the sort of mantle of competence, right? Of ability and so on. Whereas before, you might say, with the fight between the aristocrats and the demos, those were fights that were kind of out in the open, right? I mean, everybody knew where everybody else stood. Whereas now the contemporary fights are sort of shrouded in this. Well, you just don't know what you're doing. Let's say, right? If you're the demos.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, I think we need to point out the fact that there are different kind of aristocracy. Even today, there was the aristocracy by birth or by blood. Then there was a new capitalistic aristocracy, particularly if you think to the early 20th century in the United States, with the developing of the great families of the American capitalism and then global capitalism, and then the aristocracy of the educated people, so the aristocracy of competence. The problem of expertise is very intertwined with these three aspects. A democratized society needs a wide intervention by the state to function, or we suppose that we need a wide intervention of the government to function. So you need bureaucrats and experts focusing on specific issues that are regulating the society. Capitalism as well is demanding expertise, which is technical expertise or management expertise. And so politics is surrounded by this demand of the expertise. But the real problem of the expertise in politics is the fact that politics is focusing on broader values and issues. So the horizon of politics is very broad and based on values, as Max Weber told us, while expertise is based on solving problems related to specific issues. So there's a contrast between these two elements. And the other problem is that experts are trying to apply scientific knowledge, or sort of, to reforms and solving problems of the society. And we know that this is very difficult to apply to politics, while the expertise is trying to neutralize conflict. But conflict is essential for politics, even democratic ones. So pluralism of values and ideas and approaches are very different and could not be solved by a unique technical key for reading everything.
Well, actually, and Lorenzo, I think too what Mark is getting at is that the expertise itself may disguise a moral viewpoint. In other words, it's sort of a pretext. You can trust us because we don't have ideology. We're just the experts.
Yeah.
But the expertise itself might have an ideology. I'm wondering, Lorenzo, I mentioned this in the introduction. I mentioned Jacques Ellul, and I wonder how much your work depends on Jacques Ellul. And I want to mention this, and Ellul, for our listeners, famously argued that technique, understood as efficiency, was really the most important fact in modern society. This, every aspect of human life was being transformed to fit the technological model. And Ellul said actually that this model depends a great deal on what he called the plasticity of society. And he said what he meant by that was a society that was flexible about religion and traditional understandings. He said that's the kind of society which will really find itself attracted by the idea of technocracy and expertise. So how much does your work resonate with those ideas in Ellul?
Well, my work is pretty close to Ellul's thought. My idea is that, a very molded society is prone to technocracy. Because everything is based on problem solving and technical expertise and not on political values. This is a path that is depending, from my view, from basically two aspects. The first one is that we live in a complete secularized society. So very often, particularly in Europe, religion is expelled from political discourse. And as well, we live into a post-ideological society. So in the book, what I'm arguing is that today we are dominated by political nihilism. So we don't believe in anything, and everything might be solved through technical arrangements and technical organization. So my point of view is very close to Ellul, and as well very close for some aspect, particularly in the pars destruens with Carl Smith thought. So the fact that there's an attempt to neutralize conflict and politics under the label of technique and competence. And this is creating a reaction of the people against this structure, technocratic structure and institutions that are basically unaccountable for most of their part because they are not majoritarian, not representative. And so this is the main problem of the contrast today between technocracy and democracy.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and actually part of one of your intellectual antecedents, I would think, would also be James Burnham, right, who raised some of these themes in the 20th century, earlier part of the 20th century. And in fact, I did a little post over at a Mirror of Justice about the sort of some of the comparisons between your work and James Burnham's. But I think these are kind of timeless issues for modernity that continue to um, to sort of grow up in various ways, and maybe we can talk about some of those ways today. Now, Mark mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that we would talk about two issues, and I think one of them is a sort of Europe-centric issue that your thesis has particular application for the EU with its systems of centralized banks and international courts and administrative authorities and regulators and so on. Maybe you could speak a little bit about how you see your thesis applying to the EU and especially and also to the recent reaction that we have been seeing in various nation states against various kinds of control by the EU.
Well, the EU is a technocratic institution mostly because it came from what the European called functional economical integration, which means a fusion of free market and bureaucracy and rules for administering the market. So the problem with the EU is a problem of political legitimation. In Europe, the nation states are a very strong construction, albeit they are now in crisis, particularly in the last 50 years with the rising of globalization. But these identity are very strong. Sometimes in Europe we have a very strong local identity, so there are even problems with regions. If you think about Catalonia or Scotland, or as well the north and the south in Italy. So it's very difficult to create a sort of super state and to legitimize it. And I think this is very dangerous from a European perspective. So the EU now it's a strange beast, we might say, that is based on international treaties, but basically is acting as a common government on some issues. And there are many attritions and reaction as well from the electorate. So the EU institutions are perceived as too far from the people. There's not an accountability mechanism. There's not the respect of the principles no taxation without representation. Because once you have a common, unique central bank, of course, there's a sort of taxation made at European level, even if formally not, because of course deciding a common monetary policy means that you are controlling as well political economy of the single nation. And so for the fact that integration is so difficult and is not evolving into a confederation or into a proper federation, there are some new movements, we might call them populists or nationalists, that are reacting against this further integration of the EU, which is very difficult to accomplish, even because the countries are very far one from
And
the other.
Lorenzo, could I ask just one question
Yeah.
here? Is there do you find that the terms in which the disagreements are being handled or conducted involve this sort of conflict of technocratic expertise and sort of I don't want to say the word populist since you
Yeah.
just raised it, but essentially that, right? The sort of the will of various peoples on moral matters is being, or on political matters is being resisted by the EU on the basis of a claimed sort of scientism, let's say, or scientific expertise.
Yeah, exactly. This is one of the problem, because if you look to the decision made by the European Commission and the administrative structure below the European Commission, it's pretty clear that there they are applying many neo-positivist paradigms, evidence-based policies. They are always arguing based them on data and many others, scientific approach to decision making and policy making. But definitely, it's pretty clear that in Europe, politics is not dead. The prime ministers and the leaders of the nation are still playing a fundamental role, particularly in finding an agreement and bargaining among them. So what we might say is that we have politics, but without political institutions. We have politics which are relying upon technocratic institutions. And this is a big problem, particularly for the possibility of the people to understand what's going on. Okay, so sometimes the EU is overwhelmed by the promises and by the representation made by media and politicians as well. And it's not presented as a place in which we are bargaining with the other nations on our interests and possible finding common interests, but is depicted as a big state, as a big government, something that might unite everyone. And but this is very difficult to achieve. So here there's the legitimization crisis of the European Union.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wonder, Lorenzo, if we could switch now to an American example. I said that was the second one we'll do. And I'm talking about the COVID saga that we're still living through. We've just passed the 1 year anniversary of when this all began, really. And throughout the COVID crisis, we've heard a lot about the need to listen to the public health experts and quote unquote follow the science. And I wonder if that's another example of the sort of thing you're saying. And let's make it even more concrete. So in America, I think this is happening in Europe too. I know Scotland had a case just last week about this. The government has placed restrictions, or various governments have placed restrictions on worship during the COVID crisis, on the argument that this is what public health requires. And in the United States, there were a few challenges to this brought in different states of the Union. In the beginning, these challenges did not do terribly well, but then over the summer, the Supreme Court of the United States shifted and began to take a more aggressive approach to policing these public health measures. And here's what the court said in one of these cases. Members of this court are not public health experts, and we should respect the judgment of those with special expertise and responsibility in this area. But even in a pandemic, the Constitution cannot be put away and forgotten. The restrictions at issue here, by effectively barring many from attending religious services, strike at the very heart of the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty. Before allowing this to occur, we have a duty to conduct a serious examination of the need for such a drastic measure. And I wonder, Lorenzo, if you can comment on this, because it seems to me this actually presents the conflict that you describe in a very concrete way. On the one hand, you have the experts saying you need to defer to us because we know how to handle this technical problem. And then you have the court on the other side now beginning to push back and saying, well, actually, it's not simply a matter of technical expertise.
Yeah, it's a very interesting case, and it fits perfectly on my topic. It's an interesting case, first of all, because there's a technocratic institution, or we might discuss it, but it could be perceived as a technocratic institution. So the Supreme Court that is deciding upon other experts and technocratic institutions. So from my perspective, I think that judiciary power is less problematic than administrative and bureaucratic one. So the fact that there's a constitutional court or a Supreme Court that is deciding upon the respect of of the Constitution is not a degeneration into an excessive technocratic or aristocratic society. I'm more worried about the proliferation of bureaucracy or supranational administrative level. So I think that one of the great strengths of this case is the fact that you might counterbalance a technical decision with a political one. Indeed, it's interesting to see how the court is not arguing we are experts and we are deciding as experts. They are reasoning as a sort of political court or as a guardian of the constitutions, not as experts. But this is a very American decision, a very American way of thinking about this problem, because in Europe they would probably say, we are experts and we are telling you what you need to do. Probably this problem is at the moment more European, even when we look at it from the judiciary perspective. On the other side, in terms of administration, probably it's a common problem to the US and to the EU.
Very interesting.
Excellent. Well, I think, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have at the moment, but this has been an extremely illuminating interview, and we're just delighted to have you, Lorenzo, to talk about this wonderful book. Hopefully, it will be translated into English so that readers can enjoy it that don't speak Italian. Any news on that front?
No, not yet, but I think after your wonderful podcast, I will propose it to some publishers. So let's see what will happen.
That'll be great. Glad to help. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for joining us.
For joining us.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So, listeners, this has been another episode of Legal Spirits, our podcast series in cases and issues in law and religion. You can find this and other episodes archived on Apple iTunes, also on Android, and finally at our website, lawandreligionforum.org. Thanks very much, and see you next time.